Somewhere in the Virginia countryside, behind miles of fencing and unmarked private roads, stands a mansion that almost no one has ever photographed. The woman who lives there is worth approximately $90 billion. Her grandfather invented the Milky Way bar. Her father created M&Ms. Her family's company sells more candy than any other corporation on Earth. But if you passed her on the street, you would never know it. She has spent her entire life ensuring that you wouldn't. They call it the secret candy dynasty. This is the story of the Mars family mansion. Frank Mars was born in Hancock, Minnesota in 1883 into a world that offered him very little. His father operated a grist mill in a small farming community where opportunities were measured in bushels of wheat. Before Frank could walk properly, he contracted polio. The disease left him with a permanent limp. He could not run with other boys. He could not work the fields. He spent long hours confined to the kitchen where his mother Alva baked and cooked for the family. It was there, watching her work, that Frank discovered something that would change everything. Alva Mars made candy. She pulled taffy, shaped chocolates, and let her crippled son help her. The boy who could not play learned instead to temper chocolate, to judge the consistency of caramel, to understand the alchemy of sugar and heat. By some accounts, he was selling hand-dipped chocolates to classmates before he turned 10. The kitchen became his education. Candy became his obsession. Frank married Ethel G. Kissack in year 1902. He was 19 years old, ambitious, and convinced that candy would make his fortune. The following year, Ethel gave birth to their only child, a son they named Forrest Edward Mars. But fatherhood could not stabilize Frank's restless ambitions. He started candy businesses and watched them fail. He moved the family from Minnesota to Seattle, then to other cities, chasing opportunities that dissolved upon arrival. The pattern repeated with brutal consistency: a new shop, a burst of optimism, then creditors at the door, and another move. Ethel eventually had enough. The marriage ended in 1910 when Forrest was 6 years old. By most accounts, Frank essentially abandoned both his wife and his son. Forrest would spend the rest of his childhood in Saskatchewan, Canada. Raised by his mother and grandparents, he would not see his father for years. The absence would leave a wound that never fully healed. Frank remarried in 1910 to a woman named Ethel V. Healy. This second Ethel proved a more capable business partner. Together, they continued starting candy companies and watching them collapse. Frank filed for bankruptcy multiple times. Seattle failed, Tacoma failed, Vancouver failed. By 1920, Frank Mars was approaching 40 with nothing to show for 2 decades of effort except shuttered storefronts and disappointed creditors. But Frank had one quality his failures could not extinguish. He kept trying. In 1920, he and the second Ethel moved to Minneapolis and started yet another candy company. They called it the Morrow Bar Company. They operated out of their own kitchen, just as Frank's mother had done decades earlier. The operation was tiny, almost comically modest compared to industrial manufacturers already dominating the market. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source. According to various accounts, Frank was inspired by the popularity of malted milk drinks at soda fountains across the country. He wondered whether he could capture that flavor in candy form. The result was the Milky Way bar, introduced in 1923. It featured fluffy whipped nougat, flavored with malted milk, topped with caramel, and coated in milk chocolate. Nothing like it had ever existed. The Milky Way was lighter, larger for the price, and its malted flavor distinguished it from competitors. The whipped nougat center was cheaper to produce than solid chocolate, allowing Frank to sell a bigger bar for the same money. First-year sales reached approximately $800,000. Within 2 years, the company had outgrown its kitchen. Frank built a new factory in Chicago in 1928. By 1930, Frank Mars had gone from serial bankrupt to millionaire. That same year, he introduced another product, named after the family horse. The Snickers bar featured peanuts, caramel, and nougat, covered in milk chocolate. 2 years later came Three Musketeers. In less than a decade, Frank Mars had created three of the most successful candy bars in American history. The man who could not stop failing had finally succeeded. But someone was watching this success with complicated emotions. Forrest Mars, the abandoned son, had grown into a driven and brilliant young man. He had worked his way through Berkeley, studying economics and business. He had followed his father's career from a distance. Sometime around 1930, Forrest appeared at his father's Chicago factory. He wanted in. The reunion did not go smoothly. Forrest was aggressive, opinionated, convinced he knew how to run the business better than his father did. Frank was protective of the empire he had finally built. The arguments grew heated. Old wounds reopened alongside business disagreements. By 1932, the situation had become untenable. Frank gave his son a sum of money, variously reported as $50,000, along with the foreign rights to manufacture Milky Way bars. Then, he told Forrest to leave. Forrest Mars arrived in Europe in 1932 with his father's money, the foreign rights to the Milky Way formula, and a burning ambition to prove that he could build something greater than anything Frank had imagined. He was 28 years old. He was brilliant. He was utterly convinced of his own abilities. Europe would become his laboratory. He settled first in England, establishing a small factory in Slough, a working-class town west of London. The operation began modestly, producing a candy bar based on the Milky Way formula, but adapted for English tastes. Forrest called it the Mars bar. It was sweeter than its American counterpart, with denser nougat and thicker chocolate coating. The English market responded enthusiastically. Within a few years, the Mars bar had become one of the most popular confections in Britain. But Forrest was not content to simply replicate his father's success in a new market. He wanted to understand everything. According to various accounts, he traveled extensively across Europe, visiting chocolate manufacturers in Switzerland, studying operations at Nestlé and Toblerone, learning techniques that American candy makers had never mastered. He was particularly fascinated by European approaches to milk chocolate, which tended to be smoother and more refined than grainier American versions. Forrest also developed an obsession with quality control that bordered on the fanatical. He visited his own factory floor unannounced, running his fingers along equipment to check for dust, tasting products randomly pulled from the production line, firing employees who failed to meet his standards. Former workers from this era described him as terrifying, a perfectionist who accepted nothing less than flawless execution. The culture of fear he established in Slough would later define the entire Mars empire. Meanwhile, back in America, Frank Mars was enjoying the fruits of his success. He had purchased a sprawling estate called Milky Way Farm in Pulaski, Tennessee, nearly 3,000 acres where he bred championship horses and entertained guests in a 30-room mansion. The contrast between father and son could not have been more stark. Frank had achieved the comfortable life he had always wanted. Forrest was working 18-hour days in a grimy English factory town driven by demons that rest and wealth could never satisfy. Frank Mars died on April 8, 1934, at the age of 50. The cause was heart failure, exacerbated by kidney problems that had plagued him for years. He had enjoyed his fortune for less than a decade. Forrest did not return to America for the funeral. Whether this was due to lingering bitterness, the difficulty of transatlantic travel, or some combination of both, the historical record does not clearly establish. Frank's death left the American Mars Company in the hands of his second wife Ethel and a group of professional managers. Forrest remained in England, continuing to build. He added new products, including Maltesers, a malted milk ball covered in chocolate that became another British staple. He also began to diversify beyond candy. In 1934, the same year his father died, Forrest acquired a small, canned dog food company called Chappell Brothers. The purchase seemed eccentric. What did candy have to do with pet food? But Forrest had recognized something that few others had seen. The pet food market was fragmented, unprofessional, and ripe for the same quality-focused approach that had made Mars bars successful. He renamed the product Chappy and applied his manufacturing obsessions to dog food. The factory had to be as clean as his candy plants. The ingredients had to be consistent. The packaging had to be attractive. Within a few years, Chappy was among the best-selling dog foods in Britain. Forrest had discovered a second industry to conquer. Throughout the 1930s, Forrest built his European empire while watching the American company from across the Atlantic. He reportedly made several attempts to gain control of the Chicago operation, but Ethel Mars and her managers resisted. The American company continued to thrive on Milky Way, Snickers, and Three Musketeers, but it showed little innovative drive, profitable and stable. Forrest found both qualities insufferable. The Second World War transformed everything. German bombs fell on London beginning in 1940, and Forrest's English operations faced disruption from rationing and supply shortages. More significantly, the war created conditions that would finally allow Forrest to return to America with a product that would change the confectionery industry forever. The story of M&Ms begins, according to the most widely accepted account, with a trip Forrest made to Spain during the Spanish Civil War. There he observed soldiers eating small pellets of chocolate coated in a hard sugar shell. The coating prevented the chocolate from melting in the heat of battle. Forrest immediately recognized the commercial potential. Chocolate that would not melt in your hand could be sold in summer, shipped long distances, consumed in situations where ordinary chocolate bars would become useless puddles. When Forrest returned to America in 1940, he carried this idea with him. He needed a partner with access to chocolate supplies during wartime rationing. He found one in Bruce Murray, son of William Murray, then president of Hershey Chocolate Company. The younger Murray had fallen out of favor at Hershey and was looking for opportunities. Forrest offered him a 20% stake. The company would be called M&M Limited. The initials stood for Mars and Murray. Production began in 1941 in a small Newark factory. The candies were sold exclusively to the military at first, packed into cardboard tubes that soldiers carried in their pockets. The little chocolate pellets traveled to every theater of the war. Millions of young American men developed a taste for M&Ms while fighting overseas. When they came home, they wanted to keep eating them. The end of the war in 1945 opened the civilian market just as a generation of M&M-addicted veterans returned to American life. Forrest was ready. The brown paper tubes gave way to famous brown bags. The tagline appeared, promising chocolate that would melt in your mouth, but not in your hand. Sales exceeded all expectations. By the late 1940s, M&Ms had become one of the best-selling candies in America. Forrest bought out Bruce Murray's stake in 1949, acquiring full control. The peanut variety followed in 1954. Forrest had finally surpassed his father. The abandoned son had built something larger than Frank Mars had ever achieved. But Forrest was not finished. He still wanted the Chicago company. Throughout the 1950s, he maneuvered to acquire it. The details remain murky, protected by the family's legendary secrecy. What is known is that by 1964, Forrest had succeeded. He merged his operations with the original company, creating a unified Mars empire, Forrest. Mars was 60 years old when he finally controlled everything. He had spent more than 3 decades building toward this moment. The unified Mars company that emerged in 1964 was unlike any other corporation in America. Forrest Mars had spent decades developing management principles that he believed were essential to success. Now he imposed them on the entire organization with the same fanatical intensity he had brought to his English factory floors. He codified his philosophy into what he called the 5 principles. Quality came first, an obsession with making products that met the highest possible standards. Responsibility followed, meaning every employee was accountable for their work. Mutuality described the relationship between the company and its partners, a commitment to arrangements that benefited all parties. Efficiency demanded the elimination of waste in all its forms. Freedom, the final principle, referred to the company's determination to remain privately held, answerable to no shareholders, no board of directors, no outside authorities of any kind. These principles were not merely corporate slogans. They were enforced with religious fervor. Employees were expected to memorize them, to recite them, to apply them in every decision. The walls of Mars facilities displayed them prominently. New hires underwent indoctrination programs that some former employees have compared to cult initiation rituals. The 5 principles became a kind of secular scripture. Forrest Mars was their prophet. The physical manifestation of these principles could be seen in Mars factories around the world. Facilities were kept immaculately clean, not merely by food industry standards, but to a degree that visitors found startling. Floors polished to a mirror shine. Equipment gleaming. Employees in spotless uniforms following hygiene protocols far beyond regulatory requirements. Forrest himself continued surprise inspections well into his 60s, appearing unannounced to run his finger along machinery and taste products directly from production lines. The efficiency principle extended to every aspect of operations. Mars executives did not have private offices. They worked in open floor plans alongside subordinates, a practice radical in the 1960s and unusual even today. No reserved parking spaces, no executive dining rooms, no visible markers of hierarchy. Everyone punched a time clock, including senior management. Employees who arrived late had their pay docked, regardless of position. The message was clear. No one was above the system, but it was the freedom principle that most defined the Mars corporate character. Forrest was determined that the company would never go public, never answer to shareholders, never have its decisions second-guessed by Wall Street analysts. This required keeping the company entirely within the family and maintaining absolute secrecy about finances, strategies, and internal operations. Competitors, regulators, and journalists would learn nothing that the family did not choose to reveal. The secrecy extended to the family itself. Forrest gave no interviews. He did not appear in society pages or business magazines. He did not attend industry conferences or accept awards. His photograph almost never appeared in public. The same expectations applied to his children and eventually his grandchildren. A Mars family member in the public eye was a Mars family member who had failed. This culture had practical benefits. Competitors could not learn Mars strategies by reading annual reports. Suppliers could not gauge the company's financial position. Employees could not leak damaging information because employees knew almost nothing about overall performance. The secrecy created information asymmetry that gave Mars advantages in every negotiation. But the secrecy also served psychological purposes. Forrest Mars had been abandoned by his father, exiled from the family business, forced to build his own empire from scratch. The wounds of that rejection never healed. By creating a corporate culture where the family remained invisible, Forrest ensured that the Mars name would be known only through its products, never through the messy human stories of the people who owned the company. The chocolate would be famous. The family would be ghosts. The diversification that Forrest had begun in England accelerated after the 1964 merger. Pet food became increasingly important. The company acquired additional brands throughout the 1960s and 1970s, building what would eventually become the largest pet food operation in the world. Pedigree launched in 1957 and expanded globally. Whiskas followed, along with dozens of other brands that would eventually include Royal Canin, IAMS, Eukanuba, and Nutro. The logic was characteristically Forrest. Manufacturing processes were similar to candy production. Quality control principles translated directly. Pet owners developed strong brand loyalties that created stable revenue streams. By the 1980s, pet food would account for more than half of Mars' revenues, though the public continued, thinking of Mars primarily as a candy company. Forrest also expanded into other categories. Uncle Ben's Rice, acquired in 1942, became a major brand. None of these products bore the Mars name. They were marketed under their own brands, with no indication that the same company making Snickers was also filling shelves with pet food and rice. By 1973, Forrest Mars was 69 years old and ready to step back. He had 3 children from his marriage to Audrey Ruth Meyer. The eldest was Forrest Jr., born in 1931. John Franklin Mars followed in 1935. Jacqueline Mars arrived in 1939. All 3 had grown up within the company, trained from childhood to eventually assume control. Forrest divided ownership equally among them. The transition marked a fundamental shift. Where one driven patriarch had made all decisions, now 3 siblings would share authority. Some observers expected the company to fracture, but the Mars siblings proved capable of working together, maintaining the family. Unity their father demanded. Forrest Sr. officially retired in 1973, though he retained significant influence for years afterward. He had built one of the largest privately held corporations in the world, transformed 3 separate industries, and established a family culture of secrecy that would outlast him by generations. The abandoned boy from Saskatchewan had proven everything he needed to prove. Forrest Sr. died on July 1, 1999, at the age of 95. He had outlived his father by 65 years. He had seen M&Ms become the best-selling candy in America. He had seen the pet food division expand into a global powerhouse. He had seen his children assume their places in the hierarchy. He left behind a fortune estimated at several $billion and a company generating revenues in the tens of billions annually. He also left behind the culture he had created, the 5 principles, the secrecy, the obsession with quality, the determination to remain private and invisible. These would prove to be his most lasting legacies. The Mars family mansions exist in a kind of deliberate obscurity. Unlike the Vanderbilt estates that became tourist attractions, or the Hearst Castle that drew visitors by the millions, the homes of the Mars heirs have been designed to disappear. They sit behind walls and fences and tree lines on properties so large that the main residences cannot be seen from any public road. Aerial photography reveals only fragments. Public records provide addresses, but little else. The family that sells candy to the world lives in places the world is never meant to see. Jacqueline Mars, the youngest of Forrest Sr.'s 3 children, has been associated with a property in the Plains, Virginia, a wealthy enclave in the horse country of Fauquier County. The region has long attracted old money families seeking privacy and space. Estates here measure in hundreds of acres. Neighbors include diplomats, financiers, and others who value discretion above display. Jacqueline's property, reportedly, encompasses thousands of acres of rolling hills, forests, and pasture land, a landscape that could swallow a small town. The main residence, according to limited descriptions that have emerged over the years, reflects the understated taste characterizing Mars family aesthetics. No gilded ceilings or marble ballrooms. The architecture tends toward traditional Virginia farmhouse styles, expanded and refined but never ostentatious. The message is clear. This is a family that does not need to prove its wealth through architectural excess. The land itself, thousands of acres of some of the most expensive real estate on the eastern seaboard, makes the statement that no building ever could. Security at Mars Properties operates on multiple levels. The obvious measures include gates, fences, and guards. But the more effective protection comes from sheer distance. When your nearest neighbor is a mile away and your property line extends beyond the horizon. Unwanted visitors face obstacles that no security system could match. Journalists who have attempted to approach Mars residences report being stopped long before any house becomes visible, turned away by staff who offer no explanations and answer no questions. The brothers maintain their own establishments with similar attention to privacy. Forrest Jr., before his death in 2016, owned properties in multiple locations. John Mars, who passed away in 2023, was associated with residences in Wyoming and elsewhere. Each brother developed his own approach to the family's shared commitment to invisibility, but both maintained the code of public silence. The Virginia property, associated with Jacqueline, became the closest thing the Mars family had to a central estate after Forrest Sr.'s death. According to various accounts, family gatherings sometimes occurred there, where the siblings who jointly controlled one of the largest fortunes in the world could meet away from any possibility of public observation. The grounds reportedly include not only the main residence but also guest houses, staff quarters, stables, and outbuildings necessary to maintain a working agricultural property. What happens inside these walls remains almost entirely unknown. The Mars family does not host charity galas or political fundraisers that might bring outsiders onto the property. They do not appear in society magazines or architectural publications. No interior photographs have ever been published. The homes exist as rumors more than realities. Their details supplied by speculation rather than documentation. This invisibility required constant maintenance. Staff members reportedly signed extensive confidentiality agreements. Vendors who provided services understood that discussing their work meant losing their contracts. Even local residents in surrounding communities learned to deflect questions from curious outsiders. A culture of silence extended outward from the family like ripples in a pond. The contrast with other American dynasties could not be more stark. The Rockefellers built estates that became museums. The Carnegies funded libraries bearing their names on every facade. The Vanderbilts constructed Newport mansions designed specifically to impress and intimidate visitors. These families understood wealth as a performance, something to be displayed and admired. The Mars family understood wealth as a vulnerability, something to be hidden and protected. This philosophy extended to the company itself. Mars Incorporated has never gone public. It files no annual reports. It holds no earnings calls. Its factories welcome no tours. The same walls surrounding family mansions surround the entire corporate operation. Former employees have described the experience in terms suggesting both admiration and unease. The company pays well, often above market rates. Benefits are generous. Facilities are immaculate. But the secrecy can feel oppressive. Workers are discouraged from discussing jobs even with family members. Social media policies prohibit any mention of company operations. The culture Forrest Sr. established has calcified into something approaching institutional paranoia. The mansions embody this culture in physical form. They are not merely homes, but statements of philosophy, architectures of disappearance. Every design choice serves the goal of invisibility. A visitor could drive past a Mars property without ever knowing it was there. That is precisely the point. The wealth contained within these walls almost defies comprehension. As of recent estimates, the combined net worth of the Mars family exceeds $100 billion. This places them among the 5 richest families in the world, wealthier than dynasties whose names appear constantly in headlines. Yet the Mars heirs generate almost no headlines at all. They have achieved something that money usually cannot buy. They have purchased complete privacy. But privacy has costs that may not be immediately apparent. A family that never appears in public becomes a family that the public does not understand. Rumors fill the vacuum where information should be. Speculation replaces fact. And when tragedy strikes, the family's carefully maintained walls become prisons that prevent normal human sympathy from reaching them. The decades after Forrest Sr.'s retirement would test the family's commitment to invisibility. Deaths and scandals would provide dramatic material that journalists dream of uncovering. The mansions would remain standing. The walls would remain high. But the people within them would discover that some things cannot be hidden forever. The three Mars siblings who inherited control in 1973 represented different temperaments united by common purpose. Forrest Jr., the eldest, took the most active role in company management. He was known within the organization as a demanding executive who maintained his father's standards while gradually modernizing operations. John, the middle child, pursued interests ranging from ranching to scientific research, serving on company boards while maintaining a lower profile. Jacqueline, the youngest, became involved in various aspects of the business while developing interests in art, equestrianism, and land conservation. The siblings maintained the family tradition of avoiding publicity with remarkable discipline. Decades passed during which virtually no photographs of adult Mars family members reached the public. Interviews were declined without exception. When business publications attempted profiles, they found themselves writing about an organization whose leaders refused to be quoted, photographed, or even acknowledged by name. The Mars heirs had inherited not only their father's fortune, but also his conviction that visibility was dangerous. This invisibility served the company well during the expansion years of the 1980s and 1990s. Mars Incorporated grew into one of the largest privately held corporations in the world, with revenues eventually exceeding $40 billion annually. The pet food division expanded through acquisitions, adding Royal Canin, IAMS, Eukanuba, and Nutro to a portfolio already including Pedigree and Whiskas. The confectionery business continued dominating its markets. Snickers became the best-selling candy bar on Earth. M&Ms maintained their position as the top-selling candy overall. The company also moved into new categories. Mars acquired the Wrigley Company in 2008 for approximately $23 billion, adding chewing gum brands like Doublemint, Juicy Fruit, and Orbit. The deal made Mars the largest confectionery company in the world by revenue. It also demonstrated the advantages of private ownership. A public company would have faced intense scrutiny over such a massive acquisition. Mars simply announced the deal and completed it, answering to no shareholders and filing no public documents. But the family's wall of privacy began to show cracks as the siblings aged. Forrest Jr. died in July 2016 at the age of 84. His death received modest coverage in business publications, which struggled to find photographs or biographical details for their obituaries. The man who had helped run one of the world's largest companies for more than 4 decades remained essentially unknown to the public, even in death. John Mars followed his brother in June 2023, dying at 87. His obituaries noted his ownership stake, his interest in science and ranching, his philanthropic activities. But the details were sparse. The photographs few, the personal anecdotes almost non-existent. 2 of the 3 siblings who had controlled the Mars empire for half a century had passed from the world, leaving barely a trace in the public record. Jacqueline Mars alone remained from the original trio, and it was Jacqueline whose life would provide the most detailed glimpse into the human reality behind the Mars family facade, not through any voluntary disclosure, but through a tragedy that forced the family into unwanted visibility. On the evening of October 4, 2013, Jacqueline Mars was driving near her Virginia estate when her Porsche SUV crossed the center line of a rural road and struck an oncoming vehicle. The other car contained 2 occupants. One of them, 86-year-old Irene Ellisor, died from her injuries. Her daughter, who was driving, survived with serious wounds. The accident thrust Jacqueline Mars into public exposure that the family had avoided for generations. Police reports became public record. Court proceedings generated documentation. Journalists who had spent years Trying to penetrate the Mars veil suddenly had access to information that no corporate public relations effort could suppress. Jacqueline was charged with reckless driving, a misdemeanor under Virginia law. The investigation revealed she had been traveling approximately 63 miles per hour in a 45-mile-per-hour zone when she crossed into oncoming traffic. The case proceeded through Fauquier County Court with unusual speed. In February 2014, Jacqueline Mars pleaded guilty. The judge sentenced her to 3 days in jail, suspended, and a fine of $2,500. She also paid an undisclosed civil settlement to the Ellisor family. The total financial consequences represented less than a rounding error on her personal fortune, which at the time exceeded $20 billion. The disparity provoked criticism. An elderly woman was dead. A billionaire received a suspended sentence and a fine she would not notice. The case became a talking point for those arguing that the American justice system treated wealthy defendants differently than ordinary citizens. For the Mars family, the accident represented a breach in their carefully maintained walls. For a few months, Jacqueline Mars existed as a public figure. Her name appeared in newspapers. Her case was discussed by legal commentators. Her actions were scrutinized by strangers. The family's response was characteristic. They said nothing. They issued no statements. They granted no interviews. They waited for the attention to pass. And eventually, it did. The news cycle moved on. Jacqueline retreated behind her gates, returning to the invisibility that had defined her entire adult life. The Ellisor family grieved privately. The accident became a footnote, a reminder that even the most carefully constructed privacy cannot survive contact with tragedy. But the incident revealed something important about the costs of the Mars approach. When crisis came, the family had no reservoir of public goodwill to draw upon. They were not beloved philanthropists whose charitable works might soften judgment. They were not familiar faces whose humanity might generate sympathy. They were abstractions, names attached to candy bars, owners of a fortune so vast it seemed almost fictional. The privacy they had cultivated so carefully had made them strangers to the world they fed. The Mars family's relationship with their own employees reveals another dimension of the dynasty's peculiar culture. Working for Mars Incorporated has always meant entering a world governed by rules that outsiders find difficult to understand. The company pays well, often significantly above market rates. Benefits packages rank among the most generous in the food industry. Facilities maintain standards of cleanliness that visitors describe as almost unsettling in their perfection. But the price of these advantages is participation in a corporate culture that demands total loyalty and absolute discretion. New employees undergo orientation programs that some former workers have compared to indoctrination. The 5 principles that Forrest Sr. established decades ago are not merely corporate values, but something closer to articles of faith. Workers learn to recite them, to apply them in every decision, to see them as the foundation of everything the company does. The training extends beyond professional skills to encompass a worldview, a way of understanding work and loyalty and excellence that becomes difficult to separate from personal identity. The secrecy requirements prove particularly challenging for those accustomed to more open corporate environments. Employees sign confidentiality agreements extending far beyond protection of trade secrets. They are discouraged from discussing their work even in general terms with family members. Social media policies prohibit any mention of company operations, facilities, or internal practices. Workers who violate these norms face consequences ranging from reprimand to termination. The message is reinforced constantly. What happens at Mars stays at Mars. This culture creates a particular kind of workplace. Employees develop intense loyalty to the company and to each other, bound by shared participation in something outsiders cannot understand. Career tenure at Mars tends to be long by industry standards. Workers who succeed within the system often cannot imagine working anywhere else. They have internalized the values so completely that other corporate cultures feel chaotic, unprincipled, wrong. But the same culture can feel suffocating to those who do not adapt. The relentless emphasis on conformity, the surveillance of behavior both professional and personal, the expectation that employees will subordinate individual expression to corporate identity. These requirements prove too demanding for some. Former employees who have spoken publicly describe a sense of relief upon leaving, as if emerging from a controlled environment into open air. The treatment of factory workers has drawn particular scrutiny over the years. Mars facilities maintain exceptional standards of cleanliness and safety, but the work itself can be repetitive and demanding. Production lines run at speeds requiring constant attention. Quality control measures mean mistakes are quickly identified and traced to individual workers. The efficiency principle translates into pressure to produce more, faster, with fewer resources. Workers who cannot meet these demands do not remain workers for long. Yet the company's labor practices within its own facilities represent only part of a larger story. The chocolate-filling Snickers bars and M&M shells comes from cocoa beans grown primarily in West Africa, in countries like Ivory Coast and Ghana. And the conditions under which those beans are harvested have raised questions that the Mars family's wealth cannot easily answer. Investigations by journalists, human rights organizations, and government agencies have documented the use of child labor in West African cocoa production. Children as young as 5 years old have been found working on cocoa farms, wielding machetes, hauling heavy loads, exposed to pesticides and other hazards. Some of these children are sons and daughters of farmers struggling to survive on meager commodity prices. Others have been trafficked from neighboring countries, forced to work in conditions that international observers have compared to slavery. The connection between these abuses and the chocolate industry has been known for decades. In 2001, major chocolate companies including Mars signed the Harkin-Engel Protocol, a voluntary agreement to eliminate the worst forms of child labor from their supply chains. The protocol set ambitious deadlines. The industry has repeatedly failed to meet them. Studies conducted in subsequent years have found that child labor in cocoa production has actually increased rather than decreased, despite pledges and programs that chocolate companies have announced. Mars Incorporated has responded with initiatives aimed at improving conditions in cocoa-growing regions. The company has invested in programs supporting sustainable farming, providing education to children, monitoring labor practices in its supply chain. Corporate representatives have acknowledged the problem while pointing to the complexity of addressing poverty and exploitation in regions where the rule of law is weak. Critics argue these efforts have been inadequate to the scale of the problem. The fundamental economics of cocoa production create incentives for exploitation that voluntary programs cannot overcome. Farmers receive a tiny fraction of the price consumers pay for chocolate bars. The pressure to reduce costs pushes that burden onto the weakest participants, the children who have no power to resist. The irony is difficult to avoid. A family that has accumulated more than $100 billion selling sweetness to the world depends on a supply chain tainted by the suffering of children. The mansions in Virginia and Wyoming exist because cocoa is cheap. And cocoa is cheap in part because the people who grow it have no alternatives, no leverage, and no voice. This is not a problem unique to Mars. Every major chocolate company faces the same supply chain challenges. Hershey, Nestle, Cadbury, and others have confronted similar criticism and offered similar responses. The issue is structural, embedded in global commodity markets and the poverty of cocoa-producing nations. No single company, however wealthy, can solve it alone. But the Mars family's particular approach to privacy makes their position especially uncomfortable. Other companies have CEOs who give interviews, accept awards, cultivate public images as responsible corporate citizens. Mars has none of this. The family's invisibility means there is no human face to associate with either the company's successes or its failures. There is only the fortune, vast and silent, accumulating behind walls that keep the world at a distance. The chocolate in your pocket was made by ghosts, sweetened by children, consumed without thought of the hands that brought it into being. Whether the Mars family bears special responsibility, or whether they are simply participants in a system that implicates everyone who eats chocolate, remains a question that their silence does not answer. The deaths of Forrest Jr. in 2016 and John in 2023 reduced the original sibling triumvirate to one. Jacqueline Mars, now in her mid-80s, became the sole survivor of the generation that had directly inherited control from Forrest Sr. Her personal fortune, as estimated by financial publications that track such things, exceeded $90 billion. This made her one of the 3 or 4 richest women in the world. She had outlived her brothers. She had survived the scandal of the fatal accident. She remained as she had always been, almost entirely invisible to the public, whose purchases had made her wealth possible. The next generation of Mars heirs had already begun assuming positions of influence within the company. Forrest Jr.'s children, John's children, and Jacqueline's children represented a cohort that would eventually control the family fortune. Among them, Victoria Mars emerged as a particularly visible figure by Mars family standards, which meant she occasionally appeared in business publications and sat on the company board. She reportedly holds the title of board member and has been described as playing an active role in company governance. But even her public profile remains modest compared to heirs of other great American fortunes. The family code endures. The transition to a 4th generation raises questions that the Mars family's secrecy makes difficult to answer. How will ownership be divided among an expanding pool of heirs? What governance structures will prevent the conflicts that have fractured other family dynasties? Will the next generation maintain the commitment to privacy, or will some heirs seek the public recognition their predecessors rejected? The historical record offers cautionary examples. The Rockefeller family, once the wealthiest in the nation, saw holdings diluted across generations until individual heirs, while still prosperous, no longer commanded the concentrated power John D. Rockefeller had accumulated. The Vanderbilts dissipated their fortune even more rapidly, with some descendants reduced to selling family estates to meet living expenses. The challenge of maintaining wealth across multiple generations has defeated families with far more public profiles and far more sophisticated estate planning than the Mars clan has ever revealed. Mars Incorporated itself continues operating much as it has for decades. The company remains privately held, answerable only to family ownership. Revenues reportedly exceed $50 billion annually, generated by a portfolio spanning confectionery, pet food, pet care services, and food products. The Wrigley acquisition brought chewing gum. Subsequent acquisitions added veterinary clinics through the VCA chain. The company Frank Mars started in his Minneapolis kitchen has become one of the largest food conglomerates in the world. The pet care segment deserves particular attention because it reveals the strategic thinking characterizing Mars management across generations. The family recognized decades ago that pet ownership was growing, that pet owners would spend increasing amounts on their animals, that emotional bonds between humans and pets created opportunities for premium pricing that commodity food products could never command. Today, Mars operates the largest veterinary practice network in the United States through VCA. The company that started by feeding dogs has expanded to treating them, creating a vertically integrated relationship with pet owners that generates revenue at every stage. This strategic sophistication coexists with continued commitment to secrecy. Mars Incorporated files no public financial reports. It holds no analyst calls. It issues press releases sparingly and grants interviews almost never. Competitors, investors, and journalists must piece together understanding from fragmentary evidence, supplier relationships, retail data, and occasional leaks from employees willing to risk their careers. The secrecy serves practical purposes that have only grown more valuable over time. In an era when public companies face constant pressure from activist investors, short sellers, and social media campaigns, Mars operates in serene isolation. No hedge fund can demand changes to strategy. No proxy fight can threaten family control. No viral tweet can force response to criticism management would prefer to ignore. The walls Forrest Sr. built have proven remarkably durable, but the same walls create vulnerabilities that may not be immediately apparent. A company that never explains itself cannot build public sympathy when crisis strikes. A family that never cultivates relationships with journalists or politicians has no reservoir of goodwill to draw upon when it needs favorable coverage or regulatory treatment. The Mars approach to public relations is essentially to have no public relations at all, to let the products speak for themselves and hope that silence will be interpreted as dignity rather than arrogance. The balance sheet of this approach remains unclear. Mars Incorporated continues to thrive by every measure the outside world can observe. The family fortune continues to grow. The products continue to sell. The company continues acquiring competitors and expanding into new markets. By these metrics, the Mars formula works. Yet something has been lost that cannot be measured in dollars. 4 generations of a great American family have lived and died in shadow. Their achievements, their failures, their hopes and disappointments, all of it has vanished into the silence they cultivated. Frank Mars, the crippled boy who learned to make candy in his mother's kitchen. Forrest Sr., the abandoned son who built an empire to prove his worth. The siblings who maintained that empire through half a century of change. The grandchildren and great-grandchildren who will inherit a fortune built on sweetness and secrecy. Their stories exist only in fragments, rumors, court records, the rare moments when privacy gave way to visibility. What does it mean to be so wealthy and so unknown? What does it cost to buy complete privacy? These questions hang over the Mars family like fog settling over their Virginia estates, obscuring everything, revealing nothing. Present, but impossible to grasp. The mansion in Virginia still stands behind its fences and tree lines, invisible from any public road. Whether Jacqueline Mars still lives there, whether she is relocated to another property, whether the estate will pass to her children, or be sold or donated to some conservation trust, no one outside the family knows. The Mars heirs do not announce their movements. They do not explain their decisions. They simply continue to exist, somewhere behind walls, accumulating wealth at a rate that outpaces most small nations. Jacqueline Mars has engaged in some philanthropic activity that has become publicly known despite the family's general reticence. She has supported land conservation efforts, particularly in the Virginia countryside she has called home. The Mars Foundation, established by the family, funds various charitable initiatives, though details of its giving remain less transparent than foundations established by other billionaire families. The philanthropy exists. Its scope and impact remain difficult to assess. The company itself has made gestures toward public engagement that would have been unthinkable in Forrest Sr.'s era. Mars Incorporated now publishes sustainability reports. It has committed to various environmental and social goals, including pledges to reduce carbon emissions and improve conditions in cocoa-growing regions. Whether these commitments represent genuine change or sophisticated public relations remains a matter of interpretation. The company provides its own data. Outside verification is limited. Some observers detect signs that the fourth generation may approach public visibility differently than their predecessors. Victoria Mars has given occasional interviews. Other family members have appeared at industry events. The absolute prohibition against public engagement that characterized Forrest Sr.'s era may be softening, at least around the edges. But these are marginal changes. The fundamental commitment to privacy remains intact. The question of what the Mars fortune means continues to resist easy answers. More than $100 billion concentrated in a single family represents almost incomprehensible concentration of resources. That money could fund school systems, cure diseases, transform communities, reshape political landscapes. Instead, it sits behind walls, managed by professionals, generating returns that further increase its mass. The family does not explain what they intend to do with it. Perhaps they do not know themselves. The story of the Mars family mansion is ultimately the story of American wealth in its purest form. Frank Mars wanted security and comfort after a childhood marked by disability and failure. Forrest Sr. wanted victory over a father who had rejected him. Subsequent generations wanted to preserve what their ancestors had built. At every stage, the accumulation of wealth served some psychological need beyond mere consumption. The fortune became its own justification, its growth a measure of success requiring no external validation. The candy bars continue to sell. Snickers remains the best-selling candy bar in the world, generating billions in annual revenue. M&Ms dominate the candy-coated chocolate category so completely that competitors have essentially stopped trying to challenge them. The pet food brands fill shelves in every supermarket. The empire shows no signs of weakening, but empires are not forever. The history of American fortunes suggests that concentrated wealth eventually disperses through inheritance divisions, charitable giving, poor investments, or simple entropy across generations. The Rockefellers once dominated American oil. The Carnegies once controlled American steel. The Vanderbilts once ruled American railroads. Today, their descendants live comfortable but relatively modest lives, ancestral fortunes distributed across foundations, museums, and the general economy. The process takes time, often a century or more, but it appears to be inevitable. Whether the Mars family will follow this pattern remains to be seen. The structure of the company, entirely private and family-controlled, provides protection the Rockefellers and Vanderbilts never enjoyed. No public shareholders to dilute ownership, no market fluctuations to erode value, no hostile takeovers to fear. The fortress Forrest Sr. built may prove more durable than other Gilded Age monuments, or it may not. The world changes in ways no fortune can anticipate. Consumer tastes shift. Competitors emerge from unexpected directions. Regulations evolve. The climate crisis threatens supply chains. The very privacy protecting the Mars family may become a liability if public opinion turns against secretive billionaires with murky supply chains. For now, the mansion stands. The products sell. The fortune grows. The family remains hidden. If you walk through a grocery store tonight and reach for a Snickers bar or a bag of M&Ms, you will contribute a few cents to a fortune accumulating for more than a century. The chocolate will taste the same as it always has. The bright packaging will catch your eye as it was designed to do. You will not think about the family that made it, the mansions where they live, the walls they have built, the secrets they keep. That is exactly how they want it. The Mars family has always understood that their products should be everywhere, and their faces should be nowhere. They have achieved what few dynasties ever accomplish. They have become invisible at the center of American life, present in every checkout line, absent from every conversation. The candy is sweet. The story behind it is complicated. The mansion behind its gates keeps its secrets, and the family that built an empire on chocolate continues to do what it has always done, which is to say nothing at all.